What's up guys, thanks for dropping by and checking out the video. As the title says, this is basically my rehaul of a 2018 Myers mask from Trick or Treat Studios. I've actually never done anything like this before, especially to this extent, but the shots here that you see, this is the end result and I was actually very happy with it. So I just wanted to share what I did, what worked best for me in my process. Not really a how-to video, again, just showing people what worked best for me and how I achieved that. I'm always willing to learn more, of course, and I'm very receptive to feedback too. But yeah, just something fun to put together and throw out there. As you're going to see here, these are some shots of the mask out the bag, and definitely nothing too special to look at. The sculpt is awesome though, for sure, but definitely not a great paint job or hair job for that matter, but that's definitely fine for a mass-produced mask. Anyway, we're just going to go into it, and I'll go ahead and talk about what I'm doing here and the steps that I'll be taking. So right here, I'm just enlarging the eye holes, but of course I'm using Sharpie to mark out the areas that I actually want to remove. Just want to be real careful about that before going to town with a Dremel. And here I actually am using the Dremel now. I made sure I checked reference photos to make sure everything was good, my proportions were all correct. There was a little bit of artistic liberty taken here and there, but I try to stay rather true otherwise. And I'm also dremeling some of these cracks open just for more of a dramatic effect. Now we're ripping out hair, getting rid of that bad hairline. Now I'm not actually ripping out all of the hair, just that front hair, which can be a little tricky, but once you get it going, it's not too bad. So up next, I'm actually lightly sanding the mask just to get it ready, and I'm also dremeling down some little bumps and lumps that don't need to be there, just from the casting and the paint. Now I'm wiping it down with naphtha to get rid of all the grease and dirt, but that stuff can definitely be pretty nasty, especially indoors. So wear a respirator or open up your window if you can. Up next, I'm on to airbrushing, and speaking of respirators, I just now decided to put one on at this point after my place was getting all stunk up. But yeah, definitely consider your environment and your surroundings. Anyway, for the airbrushing itself, I used a gravity-fed airbrush, which was not a good idea. I'll get into that in a sec. But the paint, it's just a 1-to-3 mix of acrylic with water and also latex. So mask latex or balloon latex, as some people use. So nothing crazy. But essentially with these gravity-fed airbrushes, they do not handle a mix like that super well, even if you make it more watery, so to speak. Eventually they choke up, and you're going to be better off using a siphon-fed airbrush, which I learned this the hard way. So right here, this is where I had to switch to just dabbing the paint on. That first layer was more yellow looking, and you could see the more white paint that I'm applying now. I probably applied a little bit too much paint because of my mistake making that first layer more yellowish, but I'm just going through and trying to cover it up now with the white, just because I think that's more of an appropriate base to start on. I know some people would probably like that yellow more, but the white worked better in this case, which you can now see I'm applying the wash. So that was what the spray was here, and I just have a nasty acrylic paint mixture with some brown and green, a little bit of black, just spreading it everywhere, making sure everything's wet so it flows nice. So I'm just using some more water to let that wash flow in all those cracks and crevices to show off that definition in the sculpt. But then I run into my next issue, which was basically me letting the wash dry up completely almost. I didn't catch it, I didn't pay attention. Now it's not really even possible to wipe off with a towel. I'm basically having to spray more water on to redo all of it. Another thing that is causing issues is the fact that I kind of painted over some of those details when I added that white paint, the stuff that I dabbed on earlier to cover up the yellow paint. So that made it harder for the wash to do its job and stick in all those little crevices and creases. Now I'm having to do a lot of it with a tiny brush, which I would have had to do anyway, but now I'm doing more than I would have needed to. Another thing that I did just to prevent any potential issues was to use the brush for more precise work, but also use a lot of water to keep the paint flowing. That allowed me to do almost like a localized wash, if that makes sense. Except in this case, I had a lot more control over specific areas, and that was definitely something I needed this time around. And there's some other little tight areas where I use minimal water just to get more of a subtle effect. So I continue doing this for a little bit longer, and I make a few passes just to get full coverage. And finally, I move on to shading. I'm just using a makeup brush for more of that blended effect, and some paint, basically just black and brown acrylic for the shadowed areas. And I'm applying it everywhere where you'd expect it to be. The nose, lips, under the eyes, and then the cheeks, of course. And I'm just doing it gradually and stacking on layer by layer. Eventually, I do introduce some more colors to my palette, some more earth tones like browns and yellows, a little bit of green here, but basically we're getting into weathering, and again, just stacking on colors, building up those layers for more of a dynamic effect. Checking reference photos as I'm doing this too, and I did decide to go with more of a weathered, gritty kind of look, but definitely be careful because as you can see here, the neck was a little bit too much. I definitely had to add back in some white paint and fix that. But otherwise, this is where I ended up after making all those fixes and just tweaking everything. But very happy at this point with how everything's looking, especially with how those yellows and browns blended. And now I'm adding some extra blood for that needle puncture. I did the eye too off camera. After this, I do move on to airbrushing the clear coat, which I use Liquitex matte clear coat, which is really highly recommended. And my airbrush is also fixed now, as you can see. This stuff sprays pretty nice, and you can also put it in an airbrush without thinning. But of course, after that, I move on to removing the masking and gluing the hair back down. That was definitely an interesting process. And I'm cutting off the old ends of the hair that I removed earlier just to get a new clean edge. Just using tacky glue also, and evenly spreading out the paint. Pretty self-explanatory. You can see the hairline is actually sculpted into the mask, so I just use that as a guide. I'm using a skewer just to press down on the hair and keep it in place. It's definitely a little weird to hold on to with your finger, but the skewer helps. And you could also use that to reposition the hair and scoot it where you'd need to. Definitely got a little tricky working with these smaller chunks, and the coverage can be kind of weird, but I just did the best that I could with what I had. This hair is also real animal hair, if you couldn't already tell, and I liked the way it looked. I didn't think it was too bad to begin with. It's actually kind of nice to have on a mask like this, so that's why I kept it. It's not synthetic or anything. It's definitely not mohair either, but it's the next best thing and it works. And you could see here I'm filling in a little weird bald spot because the hair chunks that I snipped earlier, those were a little too short, but again, doing what we can. And this is the hair finally glued all down. Hairline doesn't look too good, and hair looks a little weird and short in the back, but the water and styling, it definitely helps that, as you can see. And I'm just going rough here. Just pulling that hair, getting it stretched and tangled up, purposely getting it all matted. And I'm adding the horns here, as people call it, just twisting that hair and getting it all frayed out. And you'll definitely go a long way with that classic Myers look by doing that. I'm also patting down the hair up front just to help with that hairline. and it also adds a little bit of poofiness and definition up front, which also helps sell that look. Finally, after letting the water dry off and just tweaking and styling the mask a little further, we're at this point and I'm really happy with it. I could have taken it further by using a hair dryer just to help mat the hair and get it really nasty and pat it down, but I was satisfied with how things were looking. So finally, here are some glamour shots of the completed mask. I definitely couldn't have asked for anything better, especially for my first time, so I'm very happy with the final outcome. Of course, there's always room for improvement, and I'm always looking to further expand upon my skill set and just work on everything in general. So if there is something that I could do better, definitely let me know, and I'm all ears for that. Anyway, I do have more content planned out that I'll be gradually working on, so definitely stay tuned for that as well. But otherwise, thank you again for sticking around this long, and I'll catch you guys another time.